And well, I guess we'll start. So good morning, everyone, officially now, and thanks for signing up for our webinar. My name is Fernandes. I'm president of the Georgian Association in the US. And on behalf of the association, it is my pleasure to welcome you all into this virtual discussion on Georgian Parliamentary Elections 2020. For those who are not familiar with the organization, this is the oldest nonprofit, nonpartisan organization established in the US by Georgians, and we still will be celebrating our 90th birthday in 2022. Our mission is to serve as a bridge between two cultures. We represent Georgian Americans in the US and help Georgians to understand American perspectives. So since 1932, we educate American public about very rich Georgian culture, the country's geopolitical importance, and we overall facilitate strong US-Georgian relations. Today, we are focusing on the very important part of our democracy, the upcoming parliamentary elections, the challenges and opportunities of holding elections during the global pandemic. We all are experiencing that, and it's very important to address the issues specifically for the young democracies such as Georgia. It is a great honor to be working with the distinguished guests that we have here, the panelists who agreed to discuss these issues, and we will do that from all kinds of angles. Our panelists are the most experienced and most knowledgeable people that could be speaking on this subject. Our moderator is Iya Meorvishvili, a Georgian American herself. She's a journalist from Voice of America, and she will help us moderate this virtual discussion. You will hear from the State Department. Sheriff Fernandes will represent the views of the State Department. USAID's role, thank you, Alex Sokolowski. You will hear from Nino Japaridze, Edison Research, Melissa Musio, MDI, Stephen Nix, IRI, and we all are grateful for them to be here and giving their speeches. And the most importantly, we will hear from our great keynote speaker, Ambassador David Bakradze. His Excellency agreed to set the stage for this discussion, and we will hear Georgian government's position on the situation, and we'll welcome you in a second. We will welcome your speech. I just wanted to cover a couple of household items, which is the fact that this webinar is recorded, and we will be posting the webinar on our website as soon as we can. And there's a Q&A box that we encourage all of you to use for questions directed to speakers. The Q&A box is there specifically for questions, so we don't miss any of it. If you put it in the chat, we may miss it, but if the Q&A, we will not. So that's the most important part. Please ask your questions, and we will hold them for the end, and our moderator will help moderate this whole discussion. So without further ado, I give the floor to our keynote speaker, His Excellency Ambassador David Bakradze. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be part of this discussion, and I would like to first of all thank the... Is my voice repeated?
No.
Okay, I hear my voice back.
I hear an echo.
Yes, I'm hearing an echo as well. So hope everyone is on mute. That will solve that, and that is solved. Yes. So once again, good morning, everyone, and it's a pleasure to be part of this group of professionals and distinguished scholars who has spent the years of their work on promoting and helping the advance Georgia, its democracy, its democratic practices, and I'm glad to be part of this discussion. I want to first start with thanking the Georgian Association in the United States with this event, and first of all personally congratulate Veronika Metonidze with her recent election as the president of this organization. I want to also thank Elisa Guitashvili for her excellent work throughout the years. And once again would like to underline how honored I am to be part of this group to concentrate and discuss about how the country is heading to the parliamentary election that is about to take place in 2 weeks from now, and let's start with discussing some basics, which is how we came to this election and the context that is around it to ensure that the country holds yet another free and fair elections. I believe that all sides agree that the fairest kind of election for Georgia is one of full proportionality, and it is very often forgotten in the recent debates that it was something proposed by this government when it was first elected in 2012. It was recognized then that the electoral system in use was designed when Georgia was in a very early stages of as a new democracy. So no government prior to 2012 had proposed changes to this archaic system, and logically, probably because it was seen to give the party in power some distinct advantage. So not surprisingly, no government before 2012 complained that the system was unfair. But in 2017, the government proposed the constitutional changes to introduce full proportionality of the election by 2024. This change, I would say revolutionary change, was voted along the party lines, unfortunately. On March 8th, this year already, after several rounds of multi-party negotiations, which was facilitated by the US, German, EU ambassadors, all political parties agreed on a phased transition to a fully proportional party list system for the 2020 parliamentary election. So on June 29 this year, Georgian legislators adopted the constitutional amendments that is designed to increase the parliamentary pluralism and to allow for more proportional representation in the legislature. Unfortunately, some parties, signatories to the March 8 agreement, backed out on this pledge and didn't vote for the changes, despite the call from the international partners, from facilitators, from the civil society organizations. I just want to take a moment, and given how important these changes are for my country, to thank all the facilitators and US Embassy for their role in this process. That is one part of it, which is the constitutional basis for the upcoming election, and another one is the legislation itself. And in addition to these changes that I have underlined, throughout 2020, the Parliament of Georgia carried out a comprehensive review of the electoral legislation per OSCE OD recommendation. This electoral reform, which is unprecedented by scale or in the history of the country, covers some basic principles that include election administration, which is prevention of the misuse of administrative resources, competitive and well-administered selection of election officials, which includes media campaign and allocation of the free airtime, providing citizens with a balanced, impartial, and fair portrayal of the party platforms, criminalization of vote buying, prohibition of the party donations from undocumented incomes, simplified electoral dispute resolution, electoral gender quotas were introduced, fairer distribution of the state funds to the political parties, explicit formulation of the criminal liability for voter intimidation and violation of the secrecy of vote, and many, many more. It was up to 30 amendments that this year, at the beginning of July, the Parliament have introduced. So the election of this year will take place according to the modified rules. Given these changes in the legislation and practices, as well as very strong commitment from the government, it promises to be yet another free, fair, and transparent elections that Georgia will hold. A little bit more about the context, how Georgia has dealt with the pandemic, and specifically if the pandemic has altered the context in which the election will be held. Freedom House's recent special report on the pandemic globally is particularly clear on the Georgia's condition and more to the point of the context about what Georgia did and more importantly didn't do in fighting the pandemic. The Freedom House report notes that Georgia stands out globally as one of very few positive examples of states striving to contain and overcome the COVID-19 virus. From this standpoint, the Georgian population should feel confident that voting can take place in well-regulated and safe environment. The Freedom House report notes that Georgian government resisted, and I quote, abuses of power for controlling and containing the virus among the population and was attentive to the human rights concerns, and it concludes that Georgian population has been broadly supportive to its government response and instituting strict but transparent measures to address the pandemic. I believe that this process over the couple of months have demonstrated and advanced the trust that society and public has towards the institutions, which is critical in the times when we face threats like this pandemic. Well, Georgian performance generally contrasts quite significantly with the negative impact that the pandemic had on democracy and human rights elsewhere. I want to take a moment to thank the State Department and Usaid with their global leadership in combating COVID-19. That has led to numerous number of very important projects that were introduced throughout these months that has helped country to fight the pandemic, not to mention the year-long support by the US taxpayers' money to the Georgia's healthcare system, including with the Lugar Lab Center that has saved and is saving lives on a daily basis in Georgia. Georgia, so therefore, has been successful in controlling the spread of the pandemic, and today, despite the spike, this is something which, of course, the government and the professionals were seeing coming, but this is still in the manageable numbers. So the government of Georgia has invited from the very first day the international organizations to send a long and short-term observation missions. In view of COVID-19 challenge, we all understand the hesitance, but Georgian healthcare authorities have introduced the special protocols to ensure the health safety. And we are hopeful that many will still visit Georgia to observe yet another free and fair elections. I'm really happy to see our colleagues from India and IRI here. These organizations are already actively engaged in the pre-election analysis through remotely interviewing the representatives of the government, of the different political parties, civil society organizations. And I won't go into more details about that as I see them being on the panel, and I'm happy to see the colleagues speaking and exploring about it even more. So again, thank you very much for this excellent event. I will now move to the more passive role, but will be definitely looking forward to hearing more from my distinguished colleagues and friends. Thank you all.
Thank you, Ambassador. And we will be moving to the panelists. And let me reintroduce Emil Rishvili, our moderator. She will be managing the panel and all the questions. And I will as well try to go into the more passive role. So I'll turn off my video.
Well, hello, everybody. Good morning to those who are joining us from the US and from DC, and good afternoon to everyone in Georgia. I hope you're all safe and well. We have a very interesting conversation at a very timely manner. And Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much for sort of giving us the government's viewpoint and providing us this context in which the elections will be held. Georgia has had, as we all know, many, well, in the past had successive democratic and free elections. But there were some shortcomings as well. For example, the last election where by ODIHR were rated or assessed as competitive but not fair. So it's very interesting to see how we will go into this election, this particular election cycle. And there are lots of challenges, of course, and opportunities, as we said at the beginning of the conversation. The challenges are posed by COVID that we cannot, and it's not just Georgia, and it's not just Georgian elections, but worldwide we're dealing with this issue. And Georgian government also has lots of opportunities to prove to the international community and all the partners that it is the country that, it is the democracy that it's claiming to be, and this elections would be demonstration of that. And it's great to hear from Mr. Ambassador that that's exactly what the priority of the Georgian government is at the moment. So I won't take much longer. I would like to introduce the panelists. We have a distinguished panel. Sorry it took so long to introduce all of you in more detail, but let me start with Cheryl Fernandes. She's the State Department representative, and she's the director of the Office of the Caucasus Affairs and the Regional Conflicts. We also have Alex Sokolowski, who is the Deputy Assistant Administrator of the Usaid, and he's responsible also for Europe and Eurasia region. We have Nino Japaridze, who's the Public Affairs Vice President at Edison Research, and she's joining us from Georgia at the moment. We have Melissa Musio, she's the NDI Director for Georgia, Central Asia, and Turkey. And we have Mr. Steve Nix, who's the IRI representative, and he's the Director of Eurasia Issues or Eurasia Programs at IRI. So we have a very we have the government representatives, we have the NGO representatives, we have brand new poll numbers. So let's get started by just sort of framing the environment from the US State Department perspective. And Cheryl, if you would please just talk about how important do you think this elections would be for Georgia, and why are they important?
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Ia. It's my pleasure to speak alongside such a distinguished panel, and thank you to Ambassador Bakradze for getting us off to a great start today. I'd also like to thank the Georgian Association for organizing this very timely event, very important event. As you all know, for decades, the United States and Georgia have enjoyed a steadfast partnership, and that partnership is rooted in our shared values and interests. At the heart of that is Georgia's commitment to a democratic government, to human rights, and to the rule of law. So Georgia's been a regional leader in many respects, and we hope our partners in Tbilisi will model these principles as they approach the October 31st parliamentary elections and ensure that those elections are free, fair, and transparent. From our view, the October elections are a critical step in demonstrating Georgia's continued commitment to its democratic development. Free and fair elections that meet international standards and represent the choice of the Georgian people will enhance domestic stability and strengthen Georgia's ties not only with the United States, also with the EU and the West more broadly. So there's a lot of attention here in the United States to Georgia and to Georgia's elections in particular. It's both in the State Department and in our US Congress. Secretary Pompeo, in his July 27th call with Prime Minister Gaharia, underscored the importance of free, fair, and transparent parliamentary elections and a level playing field. Secretary also cautioned Prime Minister Gaharia about the politicization of Georgia's judicial and electoral systems. On June 29th, we applauded Georgia's adoption of constitutional amendments that establish a more proportional electoral system and that should help promote greater stability and pluralism in the upcoming elections. We also welcome the July 2nd passage of electoral reforms based on the OSCE ODIHR recommendations made from the previous elections. The US has supported these efforts through technical assistance, which I know Alex Sokolowski will be able to speak more about, as well as through facilitating the March 8th agreement that Ambassador Bakradze referred to, and in our work on the electoral reform working group discussions. What's important about these reforms, though, is that they set the stage for the next equally important step. And that is that the reforms now have to be vigorously enforced to ensure that voters can cast their ballots free of intimidation, political violence, vote buying, and the abuse of administrative resources. These are all areas where we've seen repeated problems over the last 30 years in Georgian elections and where we'll be focused in the upcoming elections. Georgia has the ability to take the next important steps to strengthen its democracy. And the question really of whether the authorities have the political will to do so will be demonstrated in the coming days and weeks, both prior to and after the elections. So elections are the cornerstone of any democracy, but democratic electoral processes aren't just about what occurs on election day or even what leads up. It also includes the immediate post-election period as well. So free and fair elections are built on the foundation of safe, open, and accessible political discourse. And that bears repeating that it needs to be safe, open, and accessible political discourse. We've been concerned about reports already of voter intimidation and violence against party members and journalists during the pre-election period. The issue also emerged as a key concern in prior elections, particularly in 2018. And it's critical that civil society organizations like those we have here today that are monitoring the situation are allowed to do their job unhindered, and as well that the Ministry of Internal Affairs is investigating these cases. Accountability in elections is essential, as is equal treatment under the law. It's also incumbent upon party leaders from every party involved to send a clear message to their supporters that violence and intimidation will not be accepted and has no role in any election. Unfortunately, we're also seeing cases of extreme and irresponsible rhetoric. I'd like to urge all political leaders to focus on explaining their platforms to the Georgian voters. Issues like education, healthcare, economic recovery coming out of the COVID pandemic. An open, honest discussion of these issues are what's necessary to help voters make an informed choice for Georgia's future. We've been very encouraged by the number of parties that have signed on to the Code of Conduct that establishes ethical guidelines and basic principles that the parties will follow. Adherence to those principles will be crucial in ensuring the free and fair elections, and we encourage all the parties to take that code seriously, as well as urge other parties to sign on to it. Finally, both maturing and established democracies require political competition. It's the very essence of democratic choice. And healthy competition can only thrive in an environment with a level playing field for all parties, including access to the media. The media's ability to maintain its editorial independence is such an important component of free and fair elections in both the electoral environment and the pre-election environment. We're concerned about reports of politically motivated prosecutions, intensified verbal attacks, and threats against some media persons. The government has a responsibility to protect journalists and to ensure their ability to fulfill their role as a public watchdog in an atmosphere free of fear and impunity. Respecting Georgia's civil society will also be a barometer of Georgia's democratic health and the success of its elections. A well-functioning civil society is vital for ensuring that connection between the electoral system and the voting public. Robust domestic and international observation of elections is critical, both in documenting achievements of the government and in identifying areas for continued work. Despite the challenges presented by the COVID pandemic, U.S. volunteers are currently in Georgia as part of the ODIHR Limited Election Observation Mission. And in addition, U.S. Embassy Tbilisi plans to send out teams of election observers to supplement the observation teams by professional international and domestic observers. NDI and IRI, who are with us today, also plan to be observing the elections, and we look forward to hearing from all of those observing following the end of the elections. So in the lead up to elections and after, the United States will continue to support the efforts of Georgian citizens and their government to strengthen their democracy, improve their electoral processes, and secure the rule of law, as well as broader Euro-Atlantic expansion. We look forward to continuing to work with Georgia on this, and I look forward to hearing from the other distinguished panels on their roles in these efforts. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much for that, Carol. With this, I would like to move to Alex, and perhaps it would be a nice segue to describe exactly what role is the U.S., what is the election monitoring look like from the U.S. perspective at the moment? USAID is probably coordinating some of the participation, observation, and if you could just briefly overview what work is the USAID doing in preparation to the elections in Georgia?
Sure. Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. First, thank you for the opportunity to join the discussion today with such esteemed group of experts and fellow Georgia watchers. I also want to thank the Georgian Association for sponsoring this important conversation, and especially thank Ambassador Bakradze for joining us today. Finally, I just want to extend special thanks to Elizabeth Kvitashvili, an old friend and former USAID mission director, for inviting USAID to participate in this conversation. As requested by our host earlier, I will talk a little bit about what we're doing in terms of what USAID is supporting for this electoral process. I'll also start off with just a quick point about why these elections are so important that I think will reinforce some of the points that Cheryl made. And then I'll move on to talk a little bit about specifically disinformation in the context of this election and what USAID is trying to do about it. But first, I just wanted to make a quick point about why Georgian elections have such resonance for me. I actually started my career at USAID. My very first trip was a trip out to Georgia to do a pre-election assessment back in 2003. And then I had the chance to observe elections actually in Gildani in 2003 on that pivotal election that led to the Rose Revolution. So I've continued to be very interested and someone who wishes Georgia well and as it moves along its path towards greater democracy. So first, just a quick point about the importance of democratic elections. You know, there's a lot of these days, I think, frustration sometimes with elections because, you know, even the United States and all over the world, they can be messy. There's a lot of polarization. There's a lot of things moving in kind of nasty directions. But what I would say is that, you know, elections are essentially a process, the best process we've come up with for conferring democratic legitimacy. to loosely paraphrase Churchill, elections, despite all the problems, they're the best we've got. So they're also key moments and key tests for democracies. They're moments in which citizens are connected to their government. And so I would also argue that over the last 17 years at least, the people of Georgia have made clear that they demand free and fair elections. And so this is, again, I would say, an important test for Georgia. Secondly, quick point on this is that this legitimacy that is established by elections, that only fair elections can provide, create the basis for democratic stability, responsiveness, and accountability, which are so important for making progress in the other development areas, such as sustainable economic growth and public health. And I would offer that so much of the progress that Georgia has made over the last several years on economic growth, or the way that it's dealt with the pandemic crisis so far, are largely having to do with the fact that it has a government that's had to go through that electoral process. So to me, those are things that we need to keep in mind as we think about these elections. These are kind of key points. I want to move now quickly to a sketch of Usaid support for the elections, because I know that we're engaged in a lot of different things. We've been a longstanding supporter of open, fair, competitive, accountable electoral processes in Georgia for some time, and that we also understand that free and fair elections are too important to be left to the politicians themselves, right? Or just to the political parties. So they require broad public engagement with citizens, civic organizations, media, and then, of course, parties, but also the judicial sphere and government. So it's really a multifaceted effort. So our multifaceted effort to support these elections is a 4-year, $14.4 million effort that draws on the expertise of not only preeminent U.S. organizations like NDI, IRI, and IFAS, but that also brings together the unique talents of Georgian organizations like ISFED, like Georgian Young Lawyers Association, Transparency International Georgia, Public Movement for a Multicultural Georgia, the Eastern European Center for Multi-Party Democracy, and the Georgian Institute of Politics. And to me, this is one of the areas that for me is the most exciting that we've developed over the last several years, is to really empower those Georgian organizations to fight for free elections in their own countries, in their own country. Several of these programs and partners will monitor the elections in a variety of ways, helping to put a diverse set of eyes on the process. We're grateful for these efforts, especially because these organizations have had to be so creative and resourceful in monitoring under the conditions of the COVID-19 pandemic. We're also supporting the Central Election Commission of Georgia to defend the electoral process from cyber attacks. This is something that we've run into, unfortunately, coming from Russia in places like Ukraine, and we've seen problems in Georgia as well. So USAID has provided just under $2 million to the Central Election Commission to strengthen its cybersecurity posture ahead of these elections. So the programs that we work on also support the integrity of Georgia's electoral process in other ways. And just to very quickly get through them, they help political parties to become more responsive and to understand voter preferences through public opinion polling. And this is the kind of stuff that NDI and IRI have worked on for many years and done a fantastic job with. They also build the capacity and transparency of election administration. Those are our IFAS programs. They monitor the misuse of administrative resources, and that's the work often of GILA and Transparency International Georgia. They promote dialogue on policy issues. They encourage youth leadership, and they monitor legal aspects of the election and promote electoral dispute resolution. So we're really working in a number of different ways to try to get at making sure that we have a good election. Now, let me just move to the third and final point, area that I wanted to talk about, which is Georgia's challenge in fending off disinformation. So I would offer that reliable fact-based information and reasoned argumentation are essential for democratic systems. You can think of, or I tend to sometimes think of, facts and solid information as the currency of democratic exchange. Without them, democratic deliberation and decision-making lose trust and become impaired. So unfortunately, Georgia continues to try to build its democratic institutions. As it tries to do this, it has faced intensifying disinformation efforts from outside and to some extent inside. But from the outside, new data from the 2019 Varieties of Democracy Index, or VDEM, confirmed that the Kremlin is among the most egregious perpetrators of false information worldwide, and a disproportionate number of Europe and Eurasia countries are among the top 25 recipients of disinformation. And we all know well, you know, the Lugar Center was mentioned earlier. That's, to me, a kind of classic case of just ridiculous misinformation that spread about institutions in Georgia. So in Georgia, the Kremlin has intensified the use of propaganda and disinformation to influence public opinion against democracy and democratic values, and has exploited decreasing plurality in the broadcasting space and increased politicization of society, along with relatively low media literacy levels, to instill confusion, fear among the population about what will happen. Understanding this threat to Georgia's elections, Usaid is helping the Central Election Commission also monitor and combat disinformation. Usaid is supporting the CEC's training on disinformation, on enhancing public awareness of disinformation, and also through an information protection center. Georgian civil society organizations are also responding. In May of this year, Facebook credited ISFED for its removal of more than 500 pages, 100 Facebook accounts, and 120 groups, and 56 Instagram accounts that were spreading disinformation. ISFED has also been continuing to monitor social media in the run-up to the campaign and has identified another 12 fake accounts recently. We also realize that much of the disinformation that happens in Georgia is produced internally and is disseminated by domestic actors, sometimes for their own political purposes and sometimes using Kremlin-affiliated sources or taking cues from Kremlin-sponsored media outlets. In response, Usaid has focused its long-term has launched its first-term standalone program devoted exclusively to addressing the threat of disinformation. The new Georgia Information Integrity Program, as we call it, is a 5-year, $7.5 million program to help Georgian society build resilience against disinformation. This program is implemented by a consortium of Georgian and international organizations and is managed by the Zinc Network Limited. While the challenge of disinformation is not new, the reach, depth, and speed of disinformation in the digital age present unprecedented complex challenges. This program will build the capacity of institutions and citizens to identify fake news and narrative regardless of where they come from. USAID's new program will partner with Georgian organizations across all sectors, including government, private sector, and grassroots actors, to map the sources and measure the impacts of disinformation, to disseminate messages strongly grounded in facts, and to co-create new tools and methods for responding to disinformation. During the development of the recently launched USAID Country Development and Cooperation Strategy, which is our strategies, we defined strengthening Georgia's resilience to malign actors, including through addressing disinformation as a core development objective, and that's why we're focusing on this so closely in Georgia. This kind of program is possible in a place like Georgia, really just because of the technical skill and capacity of Georgia's CSOs to address disinformation. And this innovative project is also designed to serve as a model for how USAID can support efforts to combat disinformation in other countries as well. Finally, I would just point out that this new information integrity program fits into our broader regional efforts to help partner countries respond to malign external influence, in particular efforts to manipulate the information space. In the near term, we're confident that our partners monitoring various aspects of the electoral process in Georgia will continue to detect and call out disinformation as it emerges. So with that, I will hand it back and thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Alex. That's wonderful that USAID is so involved in disinformation aspect as it relates to the elections, because as we know, everywhere pretty much that's a major issue. And I think this is a nice segue to Nino, who is in Georgia and who's basically she knows what the effects of some of the disinformation tactics or the policies or what are the effects on the population. But if you could briefly overview, I know you have a presentation, I'm not sure if we can pull it up here, but briefly overview some of the biggest findings of the, what is the sense in the population before the elections what do the polls say, basically?
So I need for the host to disable participant screen sharing in order for me to share my presentation. So if Veronica could do that, I could then share my screen. And while she's trying to do that, I will say that it's always a pleasure to be taking part in events organized by Georgian Association, which is the oldest Georgian American association. I was president of it twice, and always Georgian Association was a place where such timely discussions took place, and the vision for Georgia and the biggest goal was to participate in the advancement of Georgia's democratic deepening. And I'm so delighted to see that this event is happening and there's such distinguished participants, and it's an honor for me to be representing Edison Research here today. Edison Research absolutely loves Georgia for many reasons, and one of them is we've had
Nino,
really,
just a quick comment. Sorry to interrupt. The screen sharing is active, so
lovely. So I will then jump while I'm making my first slide most visible. I will say that at Edison Research, you know, is the premier exit research organization that exclusively, for example, in the US has done every US election exit poll for leading networks, CNN, NBC, CBS, and ABC for the National Election Pool exclusively since 2004. And we're very busy in America, but we couldn't say no to an opportunity to take part in the pre-election environment in Georgia in partnership with Formula News. We have been able to conduct 5 robust nationally representative pre-election polls. First was last October. Most recent one was 25th of September, 7th of October, the largest sample that we've ever had in the National Representative Survey of 4,500 adults. These are voters that have the right to vote in Georgia. And our questions track views not about political, economic, social issues. And since we're so close to the election, everyone is of course curious to see what are public's plans. Are they going to vote or not? And as you see, here's the trend data that I'm showing. And in red, I've highlighted 74% of Georgian voters are declaring openly that they intend to go and definitely vote. I've been asked whether this means that this is exactly what the turnout on the election day would be. As you know, this very much depends on what Georgian voters decide to do that day.
I am so sorry to interrupt you again, but I don't think our viewers are seeing the presentation. Is there anything we can do?
Let's see. Are you seeing it?
I'm not.
No.
You're not able to see. Let's see. Let me try to share the screen again. I thought we've already fixed this, and I was doing the slide presentation. So let me try again. How about now?
No.
Still nothing.
Let's see. How about now?
Yes.
Something's
All
happening.
right.
Yeah.
Thank you for letting me know. And so I was at this slide. Let me minimize my own view and maximize the slide of the view of the presentation. I was talking about the ratings because before talking about the ratings, I just wanted to tell you that a majority of public plans to go and vote. But to the question whether that means that the voter turnout would be 74, my answer to that question is indeed it depends on what the voters would decide to do that day. It may be higher, could be lower, could be 74%. But what's interesting is that the tendency over time data shows that public has the vision of the importance of participating in the election and want to have their views counted. That's very important. And as far as the party ratings go, indeed, you are correct to say that there are many public opinion companies that have had an opportunity, including those funded by USAID, to conduct pre-election polls, including IRI and NDI. Our poll that you see right now is the latest, most recent data showing that if election were held today, 36% of Georgian voters plan to vote for the Georgian Dream. UNM would get 17, European Georgia 5, and you see the percentages decline further down the line. What is more important to highlight is that 24% of Georgian voters told us that they're still undecided or refuse to give an answer to the question of their choice. And looking deeper into this 24% population, I would like to reveal to you that the majority of those respondents, when asked again, where are you leaning towards Georgia Dream or the opposition parties, 57% still didn't answer the question. However, 30% said that they're leaning towards an opposition party rather than Georgia Dream. Georgia Dream was selected by 13% of those undecideds when asked deeper, could you please tell us which way you're leaning? Still, undecided vote is quite large, and Edison will have an opportunity to present even more current survey findings on Formula News a couple of days before the election. We're right now in the middle of our survey, our 6th wave. What is interesting to highlight is how different are the committed voters. Each party has a different proportion of truly committed voters and confident voters that are telling us that they will vote for this party. And as you see, Georgia Dream leads, followed by UNM at 81% and European Georgia. Something to highlight here is that over the pandemic period, commitment, confidence that they will definitely go and vote for this party substantially increased for Georgia Dream, European Georgia, Strategy Agmashanebeli, and even Patriotic Alliance, while UNM committed voters stayed at this high point. So there's been movement in the sort of committed voters in other parties. What is important to highlight also about sort of Georgian political culture here, everyone says that it is the party leader that determines how people's vote will go. And Georgia's post-Soviet history clearly gives us sort of a lot of meat and evidence for this, but what we've observed is that the significance and the importance of party program has increased over time, and you'll see our most recent survey shows that 43% of respondents are telling us that it is the party program that is important factor in determining which way they will vote, and the importance of the and significance of the party program has increased over time. Could this be because of all the efforts of NDI and IRI? I want to think yes. I think this might be considered as the evidence. Is this the only factor? Definitely not, but I think you are definitely making a difference, and also citizens are demanding a more responsible and responsive party structures. There's indeed a demand in Georgian society for that, which you will see if I will also highlight. Before talking about that point, I want to say that despite the fact that 36% of Georgian voters are saying that they will vote for Georgia Dream if the election were today, which is so close to the 40% barrier, as you know. Chamket is the Georgian word for that. What is interesting to see is that when asked whether they would like to see Georgia Dream party stay in the majority of the parliament, or whether they would prefer to see parliament controlled by another party, a new party or parties, pictures increasing clearly, super clear, and the tendency has remained the same. Overwhelming majority prefers to see a new party in control of the parliament. We have also another question that asks Georgian voters in terms of the type of the government that they would like to see: coalition government or one-party government, one-party dominant government, and 7 out of 10 voters are telling us that they want to see a coalition government. What does this say to us? This tells us that imagining the scenario that Georgia Dream were to win, it would be difficult for them to sort of decide about reform priorities and the direction of the country alone. Georgian voters demand collaborative political system, and this comes very clearly through our most recent survey, and the same message was communicated during our previous waves as well. Unfortunately, the list of countries' problems, I've seen this list every year I've done the survey in Georgia, and I've been doing public opinion research in the Republic of Georgia since 1995, almost every year, and several studies per year. And the list of unemployment, poverty, rising prices, being crucial issues that citizens are concerned about, including also occupied territories. This list is almost unchanged. Increasingly, opioid crisis, drug addiction, otherwise known, has come up as amongst the dominant problems in Georgia. And I'm seeing how Georgian parties are weaving into their sort of party programs and discussions with the electorate their vision of how they plan to address these issues. But the list of problems seems to be consistent over time, unfortunately. You might be surprised that coronavirus is only named by 15% of Georgian respondents as a key problem, but you have to understand that Georgian voters were able to choose 3 top problem priorities for them, and this perhaps is the reason why we are not seeing coronavirus being mentioned more often. Another reason could be because of robust measures to address this crisis, and the pandemic crisis, which is a health crisis. But you know, over the last few weeks and the days that I've been in Georgia, as you know, there are more and more cases of this pandemic, and probably our next survey will show that coronavirus is named by more people as the problem that Georgia faces.
It would be interesting to see if that would interfere with the voter turnout, because the survey clearly shows that the people are motivated to go and vote. But
I know that the Central Electoral Commission is doing all they can to inform voters of how to come to the electorate, to the precincts, and to be protected, and they will be observing all the regulations. They're well prepared. I heard the interview offered by Tamar Zvania, but we will see, right? We will see on the election day. Right now I'm showing you the slide that lists various institutions of Georgia, and I've highlighted in red political parties. You know, you would want to see political parties higher up in the level of trust than we're seeing right now, and some might say 42 is quite good, but if you look deeper, out of these 42, only 5% of Georgian voters say that they have high trust. So the 42 is made out of 5% of high trust, and the rest is somewhat trust. Georgian courts, going back to the judicial reform, you see Georgian courts are also not trusted, and similarly least trusted institution is actual banks in Georgia. We always ask about public views towards various countries and organizations, and I think the first time I asked the question about attitudes towards NATO in Georgia was 2002, and the support for NATO has risen, and we are now seeing 79% of Georgian voters saying that they view North Atlantic Alliance favorably, and United States continues to be viewed very favorably, and so is Ukraine and our European Union. Russia, in our last survey, had 32% favorability, and since July they've dropped a point, 31%, and we all know why that is. You're addressing disinformation issues, but Georgia's been living with occupation now for how many years, and occupied territories 20%, and the crippling annexation, the barbed wires that are being extended in the middle of the night. This process is a contributor to such low favorability of Russia. In the interest of time, I will not address other socioeconomic slides that I have. I will just say and show just this one slide, which I think puts Georgia in the context, the challenges that Georgian voters have day to day, to the question of whether in the last 12 months they had experienced a moment where they didn't have enough money to buy food. 47% of Georgian voters said that they experienced this. This is problem number one. Whatever the new government and whatever the parliament makeup, it will be vital to address poverty, unemployment, and Georgian citizens are very clear in their messaging, but will the parties be able to respond? We will present new data, and I would also welcome you all to join us wherever you are through social media, Facebook or other platforms. Formula News has applications, so you can watch Edison's exit poll. Just 3 days before the US election exit poll, we will be doing election exit poll in the Republic of Georgia, and at 8 o'clock, you will hear Edison exit poll results of how Georgians voted, and at 10 o'clock, we will have a deeper look at what we see and why we see what we see. What is it that, who voted, what drove these people to make the decisions that they made, when they made the decision, and I will not reveal some other questions that we have in our questionnaire. It's a very dynamic time, and Edison is delighted to be a part of it and bring this information to the public discourse. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nino. It's very interesting to see some of the shifts in the direction of the public opinion, and it's also staggering to see that, what is it, 63, 52, 43% are first three interests of the basically surveyed people are economic or of economic nature. And when we talk about the pandemic and its impact on the elections, we also need to have in mind the post-election period, and pandemic probably would cause even further damage or stagnation of the Georgian economy. So it's just interesting that was those numbers just jumped out, that it's incredible. And 47% of the people did not have money to buy food. That's also food. Yeah. So thank you very much for that. And now let's move to the civil society organizations. And NDI and IRI have been, as was mentioned a couple of times already during this presentation, during the presentations, have been working in Georgia since Georgia's independence. So they are closely familiar with the processes and especially election cycles. So if I can, Melissa, maybe if we can start from you, what are some of the, what do you see on the ground? I know that you have a hybrid sort of representation. NDI does not have a big team of observers this year because of COVID, of course, but you do get a sense of the dynamics, and what do you see on the ground, what's happening?
Of course. First of all, before I get started, I just want to thank the Georgian Association for the opportunity to speak here. And I'll also thank Usaid, who is providing the funding and the support to enable us to do the work that we do, particularly around elections in Georgia. So thank you for that. For those of you who are less familiar, I'll just give a very quick background on what we're doing specifically around elections. NDI considers itself a close friend of Georgia, and we regularly deploy international delegations to assess elections there. We're here to support Georgia in its democratic endeavors, but as always, we recognize that Georgia's democracy ultimately rests in the hands of the Georgian people. So we're there to support them in fulfilling their interests and desires. This year, because of COVID, as Ia mentioned, we've had to adjust from our usual approach somewhat. We do have an office in Georgia, but in terms of an international delegation, we have shifted much of our work to remote or virtual work. So in July and August, we conducted NDIs for the whole Institute, the very first virtual pre-election assessment, which was led by our president, Derek Mitchell, with participation from other senior staff members. It mirrored what we normally do in person. We had Zoom meetings instead of in-person meetings this time, and we spoke with members of government, the Central Election Commission, political parties, civil society, media, all of the usual suspects, and we issued a report afterwards. Since that time, we've continued to look at the pre-election environment, and we've employed a team of 8 election experts who are working remotely as long-term analysts. They're paired with on-the-ground assistance. So we do still have a presence in addition to our office. We have a presence in Georgia around elections. And then we've issued one bulletin, interim bulletin, and expect to have another one coming out sometime next week. So keep an eye out for that. And then next week, we're going to start our final virtual assessment again with senior NDI staff members and some outsiders as well. That will lead us towards Election Day. And we will be looking again at the processes, comparing to some of the recommendations that we made the first time around to see what type of progress has been made. And we'll issue a report sometime shortly after Election Day. So we are certainly paying very close attention, and I wanted to share a little bit of what we've seen thus far and how we're looking at things. As you know, and as has been mentioned by the other panelists here, Georgia is coming into these elections in a somewhat unusual situation because of the global pandemic. They're also coming in under a significantly altered electoral system, thanks to a broad-ranging package of constitutional reforms and election code reforms that they passed earlier this summer. And those two factors are shaping much of what we're seeing now. As many of you likely saw, OSCE ODIHR issued their first, I don't know if it was their first, but an interim report today. They have LTOs on the ground. And looking through it this morning before our talk, I noticed their findings align with much of what we've been seeing as well. So to encapsulate that, the foundations for credible democratic elections are in place, and they have been for many years. Recently, the country has taken very important steps to ensure greater participation of women in politics, and they're moving towards a fully proportional election system in a phased approach. However, OSCE also points out that a number of recommendations that they and others, including NDI, have raised in the past have not yet been fully addressed. As others have mentioned, these include things like provisions on campaigning and election administration, campaign finance reform, which is always a large issue, as well as the complaints and appeals process, which we always look at very closely during these elections. So still some progress to be made. But what's important now as we head into the final 2 weeks leading to elections is that authorities in Georgia demonstrate their commitment, which they have voiced, and the ambassador has underlined that this morning, to effectively implement and enforce the system that they currently have in place to ensure and uphold the integrity of the elections on Election Day. I did want to call out, speaking of reforms, before I move on, I wanted to call out especially the new gender quota, which is in place here. It has the potential to bring a number of new women's voices into Parliament. It's currently a 1 in 4 quota. 1 in every 4 candidates on the proportional lists should be a woman. And that actually changes to 1 in 3 in 2028. So we may see even more progress at that point, but it can be affected because there's also a lower threshold. So some parties we're noticing are not placing women at the number 1 or 2 slot. They're usually at the number 4 slot. So if smaller parties get in and don't have 4 seats, it's not necessarily going to have as strong an effect on women's entry into parliament. So that's something for us to watch as we see how things progress, but we are hopeful that that will have an impact, a positive impact. When we're speaking with interlocutors there, as I mentioned, we speak to both ruling party and opposition, as well as civil society. And we've heard very positive remarks, including from civil society, about the reforms and the efforts to reduce the number of majoritarian seats, to lower the threshold to 1%. And there is a lot of hope that we'll see a more diverse and politically balanced parliament following these elections. But for those of you who follow what NDI puts out for previous elections, you may recall that we have spoken about 2 Georgias in the past. The contrast between the very positive perspective that we often hear from Georgian Dream representatives and a bleaker picture that we often hear from opposition and civil society. And that dynamic is remaining in terms of what we're hearing from interlocutors. Similarly to previous years, when we talk to opposition parties and civil society, we continue to hear complaints about an unlevel playing field, concerns about potential abuse of state resources. This becomes complicated when we're also dealing with COVID at the same time, and state aid is required to go out to deal with the situation. So that's adding an additional complication to the current circumstances. But we're also, unfortunately, still hearing about concerns about intimidation and harassment and lax or biased investigations and enforcement of laws and regulations when violations do occur or complaints are lodged. So to paint a little bit of a bigger picture of what we're seeing, with the lower threshold, we are seeing a dynamic campaign environment. Campaigns got underway on September 1st, and despite rising cases in COVID until recently, they appeared to only be modestly impacted by the pandemic. They were continuing to hold public meetings, albeit in smaller numbers and usually outdoors. But recently and today, in fact, we're starting to hear more about some of these events being canceled and a bit more caution being applied on the part of parties as COVID really continues to spike. When we held our pre-election assessment, Georgia was still in quite strong position, and we'll see how that, how and if it changes as we move towards election day. But as was mentioned earlier, there is a possibility that this could impact how campaigning takes place in the final weeks of the election, which is generally a very one final strong push. There may be an effect there in terms of how parties choose to move forward. And indeed, as someone else mentioned, we'll have to see what, if any, effect it has on voter turnout. But even with that, we've seen that parties do combine. They're not without resources here in terms of how to conduct their campaigns. They've also been making more use of social media and traditional media, not simply relying on in-person campaigns. So I expect if they are concerned, we'll see a bit more in that realm moving forward. While UNM and the GD rivalry still very much dominates the political scene, it's often seen as a black and white either or, and smaller parties have difficulty breaking through the discourse. We are actually seeing that other parties like Strategy Builder, Lelo, Girchi, European Georgia, of course, are very visibly and actively campaigning to attract voters' attention. And so that's part of what's contributing to the dynamism that I referred to earlier. But unfortunately, we're also hearing of allegations of physical violence and intimidation and vote buying. Those continue to consistently come up in conversations that we have with different interlocutors. And we've seen 2 violent clashes recently in Bolnisi and Marneuli that left reporters and camera operators injured, and although investigations are underway, there's still a question of trust. So CSOs and media representatives are still concerned that because of their previous experience, investigations now may still not be impartial. So this is a point to prove on the part of authorities that they have made progress and are really holding true to the promises that they've made to uphold the integrity of elections in all respects going forward. And they have that opportunity in these coming 2 weeks. We've seen thus far, the Central Election Commission seems to have conducted its electoral preparations efficiently and on schedule. But again, a bit of the to Georgia angle here. Opposition parties and many CSOs still are voicing concerns about what they perceive as the imbalanced composition of election commissions at all levels and question whether there's bias there, partisanship there. So as I mentioned, the civil society, with all of this, they're continuing to question the government's willingness to enforce the provisions to counter abuse of administrative resources, vote buying, and other elements moving forward. So that's something to watch very closely in these final weeks.
After the presidential, sorry to interrupt you, but after the presidential elections, one of the fairly unique sort of criticism or the suggestion from the ODIHR was that there was an increase in hate speech, which was never, or at least hate speech made it into the ODIHR report for the first time. Do you see any of that? And if you could just briefly respond to that so we can give Steve an opportunity to give us a regional overview as well.
We are seeing some smear campaigns, particularly online, I think, is where a lot of this is taking place. Again, ISFED has been critical in identifying these issues and working with Facebook to call these things out. So there is a bit of that, and we asked about hate speech quite a bit during our pre-election assessment mission. All of the parties, of course, at that time renounced it and said that they would not participate, but we do urge them moving forward in these final days to really hold true to that and hold their own members and representatives accountable. I think that's really what's key. We can sign all of the codes of conduct that we want, but what's really important is that there is internal accountability as well as looking to official authorities to sanction people who violate these rules. And then just very quickly, I'll wrap up because I know Steve wants to talk too, and I think
and we still have questions to answer.
Yes, and there are questions.
Yeah.
So just very quickly, what we're hoping for in the remaining weeks is that there will be rigorous enforcement of all legislation and regulations in a timely and critically in an impartial manner. That's going to be very important moving forward. It's also important that both media and parties ensure that voters have access to balanced and reliable information, that parties participate in debates and political discussions, and that they focus on issues. As was alluded to earlier, there's hate speech, there's a lot of personality-based campaigning, but aside from COVID as a theme, which has been part of the discussion, all of the parties could benefit from digging in a bit deeper into the solutions that they would provide and demonstrating how they really are addressing these top issues that are coming up across all of our polls in terms of, it's always the economy. So NDI's polls align very much with what Nino said, and those are the issues that citizens want to hear more concrete details from their party candidates about. So then finally, I'll close that we hope that moving forward, it will be a peaceful campaign, that any violations or violence on our part is a concern, no matter how small. So it's very important that in the remaining weeks, any incidents should be investigated promptly and professionally, and then that judicial and electoral authorities ensure timely sanctioning of the perpetrators. In the past, we've seen cases that drag out even from one election to the next election, they still haven't been resolved. So it's very important to address these issues promptly. I will note quickly that Bidzina Ivanishvili did issue a statement condemning all violence. So that's important, and we hope that it's not just a statement, but that all parties take that seriously and enforce it within their own ranks. With that, I'll hand it over.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that. Steve, now you please give us this. We talked about what the concerns are. We talked about what bothers or what's concerning the Georgian society. You conduct polls as well as much like NDI, and Nino just presented some of the findings. Not to talk about polls and findings as much, but about the importance from the American civil society perspective that you represent. How important is it to conduct the elections in a free and fair manner? And what's the regional implication for that? And if you, I apologize for saying that, but if you could be brief with this, so we have a number of questions, and I would like to ask at least a couple of them. But please go ahead.
Sure. First of all, thank you, Ia, and thank you to the association for having me today. I know we're running a bit behind. I'll try to be very concise. It's a challenge to talk about Georgia in 5 minutes or less, but I've organized my presentation into 3 main areas of focus. First of all, I wanted to just recount how we got to where we are today on the eve of a very important parliamentary elections, what's transpired in the last 18 months. Secondly, I'd like to project beyond the elections, because elections are just a milestone in the progress towards building democratic institutions. Talk a little bit about the post-election environment and where Georgia needs to go. And then third, finally, I'll talk about the regional aspects, the regional impacts of the elections taking place in Georgia. So first, where do we get to where we are today, 2 weeks out? I can say that Georgia has undergone a very dynamic range of political events in the past 18 months. You all know them. I'll summarize them briefly. We had the Russian presence, the reaction to that, the demonstrations. After the demonstrations, we had prolonged constitutional amendment debates. We had revisions, as was pointed out earlier, in both the Constitution of Georgia and the election law, resulting in a brand new electoral system that has implications for this election, but also future elections as they move to a more proportional system. So a lot of developments to get us to where we are today, an election that we hope will be well administered and reflective of the will of the voters. But let me just project beyond what we are talking about today in terms of elections. And I'll start with, IRI has worked very, very hard over the years to emphasize issue-based politics and less personality-based politics and campaigns. And it was noted earlier by Nino and Edison, and reflective in IRI's polling data, is we are seeing progress, that voters are focusing more on issues, less on personalities. So it's incumbent upon political parties to continue to make that the focus of their platform and their campaigns, and less on personal attacks, personal issues. So we're seeing progress. That has to continue in the post-election period, where a lot of the things we've talked about are going to require bipartisan support in the new parliament to move Georgia forward. And let me just go through a couple of them. First and foremost, every IRI poll that we have done in the last 20 years reflect 2 main things. Georgians want to be part of European institutions such as the EU and NATO, overwhelmingly. And secondly, the main issues, the things that matter to the Georgian people, are the economy and jobs. And so in the post-election period, that has to be the focus of the parliament and the government. And this is particularly challenging when one wants to create jobs and restart the economy in a period of the pandemic and all the threats that that poses to economic change. So this will require bipartisan support. We all know that the government can't merely wave a wand and create jobs, but there are a number of things that a new parliament can do in terms of regulation of small, medium, and large businesses, tax code, tax revisions, to help promote job creation in the private sector. But the Georgian government needs to take steps to put Georgians back to work to alleviate some of the economic misery that we are seeing reflected in our polling data. So that's very important. Secondly, in addition to moving towards more issue-based politics, issue-based reforms, there needs to be more focus on youth and youth inclusion. You heard about the inclusion of women as a part of the political process. It's equally important because IRI data shows that while Georgian youth, those aged 18 to 25, are most supportive of democracy, most supportive of EU and NATO engagement, they are also the least likely demographic to vote and participate in politics. So IRI has worked very hard in a number of youth programs to promote youth participation. They're the future of this country and they need to play a greater role. So we'll continue to work towards that. And then another point in the post-election world is decentralization of government. Once we get through this election cycle, we're going right into another election cycle for local government, local elections. Sakrabulos may remain an important part of local government, and we feel that Georgia needs to continue on the path of decentralization. We've seen neighboring Ukraine have great success in devolving power to localities, and we'll work very closely with the Georgian government to try to realize greater decentralization. But that, again, should be a priority of the new Georgian parliament once elections are over. And then just a couple of notes, because I know my time is limited. Regionally, what is taking place now in Georgia does have an impact on the region, both in the Caucasus, but also in the broader Eurasia region. First of all, we all know about the armed conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh. Again, we're all watching this very anxiously and hoping for a peaceful solution. I want to applaud the Georgian government for offering to mediate a way out of the conflict, and those efforts should continue. But it's important now in this time of upheaval in the Caucasus country that Georgia have a well-organized, well-administered, peaceful election that reflects the will of the people. I think that sends a strong signal in the Caucasus and demonstrates Georgia's role as a democracy. So it can really show the region that democracy is thriving in the Caucasus and send an important signal beyond the Caucasus. And we all know the situation that we face in the region. We have complete political, constitutional, and legal upheaval in Central Asia, in Kyrgyzstan. We have the hot war in Nagorno-Karabakh. We have a hoped for political transition, but a political stalemate in Belarus. So looking at the region, I think Georgia, by conducting an election, again, well administered, reflective of the will of the people, will send an important signal throughout the region that democracy will prevail in Georgia and Georgia will continue to build democratic institutions. Again, I'm reaching the 5-minute limit. I'll close by saying that our late, great chairman, Senator McCain, who led IRI for 25 years, was very devoted to the Georgian cause, Georgia's independence, its sovereignty, its democracy. So a big part of IRI's role in Georgia is to continue to build upon John McCain's legacy, and we will continue to do that. I'll end my remarks there, and I'll be happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Steve. You were just right on. You kept your promise. Thank you very much for that. This was so multifaceted, what we talked about. We talked about the situation on the ground, the US government's positions, some of the concerns, the Georgian government's positions, the polling. we have a number of questions that address directly these topics, and some questions are not. So I'll try to go through the questions that the viewers are submitting that are more relevant to the conversation. And then if we have time, we'll address some others. But we have one question that was submitted in advance, so I'm just going to summarize it. And the question is basically about if there is any anticipation or any doubt of the government's ability to conduct free and fair elections in the midst of global pandemic. And the question continues, do you have any reason to think that ongoing pandemic will be used to suppress voters or otherwise impede election process by the Georgian government? So if it's okay, I would like to break this question up in two parts. So if we can address maybe the government's ability and sort of the political side of it. If Cheryl, you and Alex, you could address this very briefly. I'm again sorry for repeating myself about this, but if you could be concise about it. Do you feel that Georgian government is going to or can interfere or anticipate any sort of inability of the Georgian government to conduct these elections?
Happy to take that on. Thank you, Ia, very much. And then I'll let Alex chip in as well. I think really the crux of the issue is the political will. The Georgian government has the ability to ensure, even with COVID, that there are free and fair elections in Georgia. It certainly will present challenges given the COVID situation. But I do believe that it is something that the government has the ability to focus on, the ability to address, and the ability to find ways around and to ensure public safety as well as the security of the vote in the crisis. It really does come down, just like enforcement of the reforms that have been enacted this summer, to the political will to take action on that.
And if I can just jump in and add, I generally agree completely. I would just say that there's a little bit of the wrinkle here, which is I think even any country, including say the United States, it's about to have an election that has the will to do this. There has to be a kind of conscientious approach to think through what are the things that could go wrong, what are the ways in which we can avoid spread through this process. So I think it is about the will, but it's also about thinking carefully about looking at the polling sites, thinking about how people can, be well informed, how they can go into a polling station and not have fear and concern about catching the virus. So yes, I think the intention overall is there, but I want to just recognize that it is a difficult situation in which to carry out such an election.
Yeah, thank you. And Melissa and Steve, perhaps you could address the second part of that question, which is, do you actually see any evidence? Like, are we seeing anything that's concerning that the government may be using, or is there potential for the government to use pandemic to do the voter suppression?
Just briefly, Ia, I would say to support what Alex and Cheryl have said, this is a unique challenge for the government of Georgia to conduct elections in this pandemic environment to ensure the safety and health of participating citizens, and at the same time ensuring that the elections are free, fair, transparent. It is not an easy task, and I don't envy the CEC and the other ministries in trying to do that. But that's really the challenges. How do you move forward to ensure these elections are reflective of the will of people without sacrificing the safety and security of the citizens? Our interpretation, our take is that the CEC has put in place a number of measures to ensure both. Hopefully both will be realized, but it is a real challenge and not an easy task for the governing authorities.
Yeah, Melissa?
Yeah, I would agree with what's said. I think Alex raised a very important point in terms of transparency and communication. So it's one thing to take adequate steps, but there's an extra effort and an extra step that needs to happen to ensure that the public is aware of the steps that are being taken and that they understand the logic behind it. There is potentially some confusion and questions about what the government is doing, where they're doing it, and there's disinformation around the topic of COVID specifically. So I think that further complicates what we're looking at here. And so it's a huge challenge. I think they are capable of doing it, but it takes a lot of careful thinking and again, transparency and communication about it, because the government has a bit two roles right now. They are taking care of the welfare of the people. They also have a party hat and are running as contestants in this campaign, and those two can get blended at this period. So those are all elements that make this a very complicated situation.
Thank you so much. We are basically over the time, but I still would like to, if the speakers don't have to run, there are a couple of quick questions that I still would like to ask. And Nino, I would like to start from you. What's at stake for Georgia at this elections? What are we, every time elections come around, we say this is the most important election cycle for Georgia. Georgia's going to prove that it's a democracy that we've been saying it was. What do you think? And please, the rest of the panelists, please think about your brief response to this question. What's at stake?
I think this is a real opportunity to clean up our past record. It was quite unfortunate that in 2018 was the first time that elections were found to be not free but not fair. When elections were neither free nor fair, Georgians responded with a Rose Revolution. No one wants a revolutionary scenario. There is no need for that. Society has evolved and there are procedures. So let's try to really clean up that black spot and conduct free and fair elections. But elections are not decided on the day of the election alone. And to go back to the previous question, what the government of Georgia could do, indeed, in addition to COVID and informing citizens of what they're doing to help have a safe electoral environment, government officials and political party of Georgia Dream has an opportunity to appear on Georgian media networks where other party politicians are inviting them to participate in a debate. You could say that this already happened because, for example, yesterday, Georgian public TV network, Channel 1, hosted such a debate, but we all know that most watched networks are Imedi and Rustavi, and you do not, and Tavari, as well as other independent networks that have increased the ratings. We all know them, including Formula and TV Pirveli. And it is almost impossible to see Georgia Dream seated next to an opposition party, which is a list, and there's so many of them, and including young politicians. So I hope that in these 2 weeks, this record, which is not democratic, not pluralistic, would be corrected. I think this would be the most significant contribution to improving the pre-election environment. An easy way to do that too. It doesn't cost much money, just time.
Cheryl, I would like to ask you to please answer that question. What's at stake? And please keep in mind U.S.-Georgia relations, of course, from that context, not just in general for Georgia.
Yes. No, I would say this is, as we always say, and as you noted, every time there's an election, we talk about this is the most important election, and this is an opportunity to demonstrate Georgia's commitment to a democratic path forward. I think in particular, given the concerns that were voiced over the past year, given the concerns following the June 20th demonstrations last year, concerns of some democratic backsliding, this is an election that will be watched particularly closely, both by the executive branch, the Department of State, USAID, others, and by our Congress, with the legislative branch really carrying the power of the purse. We see multiple congressmen, including longtime friends of Georgia, that are watching this election very carefully as an indicator of Georgia's commitment to its path forward.
Alex, do you have anything from your perspective? What's we talked about, and I'm sorry to put you on the line here, but we have, oh, my Alexa just thought that I was talking to her. There was, for the first time ever in from the Hill, we heard the conditionality basically of the assistance towards Georgia, that certain steps have to be taken and Georgia needs to demonstrate to the friends again on the Capitol Hill that it's moving in the direction, democratic direction that that's expected from a strategic partner. Do you anticipate, what are your thoughts about that? Do you think this election is somehow connected with that conditionality, 15% assistance withdrawal conditionality from the Hill?
Yeah. Well, we do know that Georgia benefits from a lot of positive attention from the Hill, and we can say that in USAID funding levels, which is good. But what I think has happened over the last several years, which is entirely natural, is that people hold Georgia to very high standards. And I think Georgia wants to be held to those high standards. So with every election, if there's some concern, I know, that we want to see Georgia succeed and continue to stay on a path towards a democratic consolidation. I know, I think regionally, I focus on our whole region. And again, I talk about Georgia as a positive example. And so we don't want to lose that positive example. It's got high standards. So I think with that additional, those resources and those additional positive attention that Georgia gets, there is sometimes a little bit of extra scrutiny. In other words, that we hold it to high standards. So that's what we're hoping for.
Thank you very much. And from Alex, again, very briefly to you, and we'll let you go very, very soon. This information, you addressed this information, which is a huge topic, of course, both in Georgia and the US, anywhere else in the world. Russian disinformation is in particular of a very heavy significance, pre-election period, COVID. Do you see any evidence of the Russian interference in this pre-election period right now? Do you have any specific examples of that?
Sure. I mean, I would answer that in two ways. One, as a person who used to spend all my time focusing on elections and political processes, I would always make the point that elections are not about election day. And even when there is a pre-election period, which is the formal beginning of the campaign legally in a certain country, the election period starts earlier, right? In other words, that really it's in several months running up to an election period in which there's an ongoing conversation. And some of the stuff that I talked about earlier in the day about, during my presentation, I think indicate an ongoing effort on the part of Russia through things like Sputnik International and other things to try to infiltrate the Georgian information space. I would say more specifically with regard to this election and more, in some ways, in a more clear way, we're seeing attempts at what I see as interference. There have been credible claims, in my view, or allegations of attempts to curry favor or even finance certain political parties in Georgia on the part of the Kremlin. And then also, again, to our work related to cyber attacks. There have been cyber attacks on the government of Georgia coming from the Kremlin. And the Kremlin has done this in places like Ukraine to try to hack into the Central Election Commission, to discredit it, at best make it seem disorganized, at worst try to present false results. And so I think it's prudent that we're helping the CEC to harden its cyber defenses. So I think it wouldn't be wise for us to be ready. And I also, I remember in late August, Ambassador Degnan also made the point that we should expect interference or meddling from the Kremlin during this electoral cycle. So I'm happy that we're prepared and that we're putting our defenses up, because it's important that Georgians be able to decide this election and not have external malign influence somehow affecting it.
Well, thank you very much. I hope that those defenses and those efforts are successful. everywhere, and good luck to you in doing that. Without abusing your time any further, I'm going to pose the final question to every panelist, and please, again, be brief. And Carol, if you don't mind going last, I think that would be ideal. So, Melissa, what do you think? How do you think what are the biggest concerns and that you have going into these elections, and what are the opportunities as you see for the Georgian government, and from your perspective, what's at stake here?
Yeah, we're still in the process of observing and seeing what's going on, so I don't want to pass judgment right now, but I do think this is an opportunity for the Georgian government to stand behind the progress that it's made and behind its promises to focus on the integrity of the elections. And sometimes that may mean sanctioning its own members, but all parties really are playing a role in this, and I think that's something that we are watching very closely. I also see an opportunity here for Georgia as a whole, and it's much more forward-looking. For years, Georgia has been decades even, has been dominated by one party, whether that's UNM, whether it switches to GD, and it often goes to all levels. It's national level, it's at the local level, it's within the ministries. There's really one party dominance. Here, with the lower threshold, we have a real opportunity for some of the smaller parties to enter parliament, for there to be diversity, more women's voices. I noted that someone mentioned looking at ethnic minorities next, and I think that's a very important point, and one that NDI focuses on in its observation as well. So we have an opportunity here to serve the diverse interests and voices of all of the Georgian people. And let's see if we can fulfill, if Georgia can fulfill that. And the international community is certainly there to support them in this effort.
Mm-hmm. Steve, any final thoughts on those same issues?
Sure, just real quickly, it affords Georgia an opportunity to conduct an election that's viewed as representative of the will of the people. And importantly, a multi-party parliament. So again, this has been the issue that IRI and NDI have dealt with for many years. And the hope is that, again, with the lower threshold, this will be a multi-party parliament, and that will allow political parties to continue to build upon their successes in this election and truly create a multi-party competitive political system. And then, as I said earlier, it's a chance for Georgia, by administering an election that is well conducted, well administered, and show in the region, beyond the Caucasus, but throughout the region, that there is stability in Georgia, and Georgia can be a prime example in the face of a lot of upheaval in the Eurasia region. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Nino, now you came to us today with lots of numbers. So based on some of what you saw in this survey, what do you think are some of the biggest challenges that people view in this period? I mean, as it relates to conducting the elections in a free and fair way. Any challenges in particular that the survey showed, and any opportunities that you can talk about?
Challenges, how people, Georgians, despite the difficulties of the context, remain largely optimistic. It's really amazing. When asked about whether you feel anxious, indifferent, or positive, more significant proportion of Georgian public is optimistic. So I hope that political class will support and facilitate this optimism. Georgia has had so many elections. We've learned on so many mistakes. I think every player knows what their role is, and there is this code of ethics that parties signed. You know, we sign documents, but do we live it out? It's so important to live out what we commit to and to communicate these principles to our supporters. And I think the opportunity that we see is that there are 2 weeks these are critical days that every party should use to connect with Georgian voters. I was an observer in 2004 in Sadakhlo, which is an area where Azerbaijani minority lives largely. And I recall that day being told that the only day that politicians think of us is on the day of the election. It seems that this has been the sentiment throughout Georgian, even recent past, but today I'm seeing different Georgia. Politicians are more motivated, it seems, because the threshold is lower. They see that there's an opportunity to form a coalition government. Georgians want change. There are a lot of issues to be solved, and a lot of politicians are empowered by this demand from the public. So let's hope that everyone plays their part. And I again emphasize the importance of Georgian Dream to appear on media networks and to allow, in this case, IMEDI should allow non-Georgia Dream political campaign ads to be placed. I know there have been protests about that. It's important that political messages, paid or not paid, are available on networks where parties take those messages. And last point, if there is time in these 2 weeks to deliver factual news and information about what's happening in Georgia and the broader region to Armenian and Azerbaijani ethnic minorities. They're minorities, but they're quite dominant in the number. They're citizens of Georgia, and they do not receive news from Georgian media. And in the context of Nagorno-Karabakh and what Georgia is or is not doing, this could really be that Trojan horse that would really derail the democratic process. So anything USAID and USAID funded entities could do through social media, and not only, because TV still remains the dominant source of news and information if you're focusing on the population that is not young. So there is time, let's be optimistic, and I hope Georgia clears the record and shows a very powerful message of what it means to be committed to democracy, and each vote matters.
Yeah. Sorry, Alex, I'm going down the participant list, and there is not. But please, if you have any concerns, opportunities, recommendations.
Sure, thank you. Well, what I would just say is that I'm sorry, I'm going to have to jump off right after this because I'm about 16 minutes late for a meeting. But just to build on some of what I've heard really quickly, what I would suggest for those of us that wish Georgia well and wish to advance the cause of democracy building in Georgia, I think we should continue to take the stance of constructive vigilance, right? Both those sides. Constructive, which is thinking about ways, open-minded to say, okay, can this code of ethics work? You know, how can we work with the government of Georgia to push this forward despite COVID? But at the same time, being vigilant to look for those cases in which we're seeing problems and possible violence or anything, use of administrative resources. So to me, that concept of constructive vigilance is what we need as we go forward into these elections. And thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your time. Cheryl, please. So again, I don't want to put you on the spot, but there's been in the past year or so, there was a strain, at least from the outside, that's how it looks, that there was a strain in the US-Georgian relations, mainly from the US side, emphasizing on the democratic backsliding, some of the perhaps business, not practices as much, but creating a free and competitive business environment in Georgia. Keeping all this in mind, keeping in mind that there are elections coming up in the US as well, not only in Georgia. How do you see US-Georgia relations? I know it's a very loaded question, very multifaceted, I apologize for that, but take it in any way you want. And how do you see what's next? What are we looking at in the future?
Absolutely. Well, I would say, first of all, that I don't think relations were strained. We did have some concerns that we voiced on potential democratic backsliding, but this is a strategic relationship. It's an important relationship, and it's a relationship based on shared values. And so we have those discussions between the US and Georgia. We also, as Alex pointed out very rightly, hold Georgia to a very high standard. Georgia has set that standard for themselves, and I think they want to be held to a high standard. It's that foundation of shared values that really is at the core and the crux of our relationship. So I think the elections are an important step for Georgia. They're an important reminder to us and an important way for Georgia to demonstrate its continuance on the path forward. I'll kind of sum up with, I was glad to hear some of the discussion on elections as really being the concrete connection of an individual to their government. And I also take Nino's point of how optimistic Georgians are headed into these elections. This is an opportunity for the Georgian government to strengthen and reestablish that tie to its own people and that commitment from the government to listen to the voice and the will of its own people. That accountability that each democratic government has to its own electorate and to its people. The U.S. is happy to stand with Georgia as they're approaching the elections, and we'll continue our strong relationship with the Georgian government, no matter who comes out in the elections as the ruling coalition, ruling party, whatever the results are, because we do have that strong values-based relationship.
Thank you very much for that. And Mr. Ambassador, this is your opportunity to, after listening to concerns, suggestions, friendly recommendations, Georgia clearly has some challenges to overcome, both from the conduct of the elections perspective, as well as from the pandemic perspective. So what are your thoughts about challenges and opportunities, given what, after listening to all we heard today?
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you to all the panelists for their contribution to this discussion, very timely again. I think one thing is very clear. Georgia has made an important steps over the course of last several months to advance to the level when everyone following Georgia, watching Georgia, recognizes that these steps at the legislative level, at the constitutional level, were very significant to ensure the level playing field for those participating in the election. This, coupled with the very strong commitment by the government, by the Prime Minister personally, to hold free and fair election, is a very good background to move forward and vote on the election day. There were mentioned some of course, news that are not welcomed, some violent clashes in Bolnisi and Marneuli. And it was also mentioned that immediately the response from the government, from the ruling party was very immediate to condemn that and call on every supporter for their behavior at the highest standard. But in addition to that, it wasn't mentioned that in addition to that, it was important that the investigation has also led to the arrest of the ruling party supporters. That has sent the strongest possible signal. And we have 2 more weeks left, and I'm confident, I have a confidence in the political establishment of my country that we'll have an exemplary time moving forward. This is also something that, let me move to the challenges that pandemic has caused, and you have asked that question, yeah. I think that the record of the government so far has demonstrated that this government is capable and will ensure the most safe environment for the voters during these elections. One of the latest polls of, I think, IRI demonstrated that there is 80+% support or favorability to how the government has dealt with the virus. So if any government has a trust of its public to show up at the polling station and vote in a safe environment, that is the Georgian government, and I am confident that they will come and do that. Now, well, the economy was also mentioned, and pandemic, of course, did deal a blow to the Georgian economy, just as it did to everyone else's. But fortunately, we begin our recovery from a very good base, and I think this election presents a good opportunity for the post-pandemic environment to present Georgia yet again as a country that is already known on easy of doing business, on the free economy, on the low of taxes or low corruption, solid banking sector, low cost energy, etc., etc. I won't go through all that, but throughout these years, all major investment organizations, including OPIC, now DFC, has really, through their substantial portfolios and projects in Georgia, have demonstrated that this is the country to invest in. And free and fair election will send a signal to many investors in Georgia, including those who are 300 plus American companies, that Georgians are serious about their growing position in a global economy and their commitment to protect it. And in that sense, a free and fair election is a two-way street. It signals democratic maturity as well as opportunity for those seeking stable political environment at the center of critical global trade flows to invest their capital and expertise. This strategic partnership is very strong. To quote the Assistant Secretary or Ambassador Degnan, their messages of this spring, it's stronger than ever. And this is the will and commitment of Georgian public, its government, to move this upward, to solidify even further our strategic partnership, and that is what this election will continue to demonstrate.
Thank you very much for the optimistic and uplifting final comment. As Georgia is heading into the election cycle, we all know that some of the cases, new cases have increased dramatically, as well as the, unfortunately, the casualty rate of the disease. So good luck to Georgia and all participants in conducting safe, free and fair elections. And I do appreciate your time. I apologize for this running so long, but you all had so many interesting things to say that I did not want to interrupt. So thank you very much.
And on behalf of Georgian Association, I just wanted to say again, a huge thank you to all the participants. Your knowledge, insights really helped this webinar to be lively and informative. I'd like to take this opportunity, and given the questions that have not been answered in this Q&A session, I'd like to take this opportunity and ask you back in a month after the elections and see how your prognosis worked out or whether they did not, and give more opportunity to discuss the future once we all know who is where, like in Georgia and in the US. So it's going to be very interesting to have a new start with the same participants and reassess the outcome of the election. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good luck,
Thank
Nino.
you, everyone. Thank you to you all. Stay
Thank
safe. Wear masks.
Yeah.
Wash hands.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
And Veronica, thank you most of
it. Thank you.
Thank you. I did not
Thank you guys. It was great.
Thank you both.
Thanks, Melissa. It was great to have you.